Russia had reached a crossroads. On one path lay modernization, on the other, tradition. The point was not to choose one or the other, but to combine the two. And for a moment it seemed to be working. A new constitution, a new capital, a new army. Alexander II had embarked on a program of rapid reform, convinced that change was necessary to save the empire. But one reform could not remake Russia, not while millions of people remained trapped in a medieval system of servitude. In 1861, the Russian Empire boasted a population of over 100 million. Of those, 22.5 million were classified as state serfs, tied to the land they inhabited and belonging to the nobility. Their hours were long, their wages were meager, and their lives were brutal. While some serfs might have enjoyed greater freedoms under their masters, others endured horrific abuse. In the South, serf life bordered on slavery. Overseers punished them severely for minor infractions, beatings, whippings, and banishment to Siberia. Escapees who fled their masters risked execution if caught. The most horrific punishments were reserved for women who ran away or engaged in petty theft. They could be locked up for years, sometimes decades, without trial. Others were sent to work in the mines or sold off as property. Reformers, both inside and outside of Russia, considered serfdom a stain on the empire, a vestige of feudalism that hindered the nation's progress. Some nobles even began to voluntarily emancipate their serfs, granting them freedom in exchange for money or labor obligations. But these acts of kindness were rare and hardly made a dent in the overall system. For that, it took a royal decree. And when Alexander II ascended to the throne in 1855, he faced mounting pressure to end serfdom once and for all. His own ministers called for reform, as did countless intellectuals, academics, and activists. Soon, students began circulating a petition calling for the abolition of serfdom. When it reached 40,000 signatures, they delivered it to the Winter Palace. There they were met by General Butelin, a close advisor to the Tsar. He promised to pass their demands along, then closed the door and forgot about it. Months later, student leaders found out why. Butelin and Alexander II had just returned from France, where they had learned about the June Revolution of 1848. A series of mostly unsuccessful rebellions across Europe aimed at ending aristocratic privilege and establishing republicanism. The Tsar understood the threat serfdom posed to the empire's stability and set about drafting his own reform. It would not abolish serfdom entirely, nor would it compensate the nobles for the loss of their property. Instead, it would turn serfs into state peasants. Each would receive a small plot of land to own and cultivate. In exchange, they would have to pay rent and perform a certain number of days of labor on their former master's lands. These terms were more favorable than many had expected, but that was the point. Alexander wanted to avoid revolution at all costs and believed gradual reform was the key. When he announced the emancipation of the serfs in February 1861, there was little outcry. Nobles lost their human property but gained a class of cheap labor. Peasants gained personal freedom but lost economic security. Both sides felt cheated, which meant Alexander's gamble paid off. For the first time, millions of Russians could travel freely, work in factories, or start businesses. They could also vote, although only for certain candidates. The government hoped that now free, educated, and healthy, the peasants would contribute to the nation's prosperity. But that required an educated populace, something Russia sorely lacked. Only 3% of Russians could read and write, especially true in the countryside, where some 85% were illiterate. To solve this problem, Alexander II launched a massive campaign to build schools across the empire. Between 1863 and 1880, primary education rose from 38 to 54%, secondary education from 4 to 15%. Literacy rates grew dramatically. At the turn of the century, only 10% of Russians could neither read nor write. But by 1900, that figure dropped to 2.5%. While literacy and industrialization grew, so did unrest. Much of the new wealth generated in Russia's cities went to the very people who had once owned the peasants. The gap between the rich and the poor grew ever wider. For the aristocracy, life was indeed improving. Between 1861 and 1900, the nobility's income doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled. But for the workers who fueled that growth, life was miserable. In 1866, workers in the textile factory of Nikolai B.I.B., trying to protest low wages and grueling hours, went on strike. When management refused to negotiate, the workers walked out. But within weeks, they were all back inside. Strike leaders had been fired and replaced with willing strikebreakers. Such was the state of Russian capitalism, so underdeveloped that any hint of dissent was met with brutal force. For the next 4 decades, strikes and political dissent continued to grow. But none would threaten the empire more than the movement led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. While Alexander II had successfully staved off revolution, his reforms proved too radical for his successors. When he died in 1894, his son, Alexander III, took the throne. He rolled back many of his father's reforms, reintroduced censorship, cracked down on unions, increased the power of the secret police, exiled revolutionaries, and even shut down the country's parliament. His policies alienated liberals and leftists alike. Now, when the masses protested, it wasn't just against the ruling regime, but the entire system of government. But no one could have predicted how far things would go. The catalyst arrived in the form of a war, a conflict that would pit Russia against the Ottoman Empire. As the two sides negotiated peace, a rumor spread through the Balkans that the Russians had agreed to allow Serbia to annex Bosnia. When the Ottomans heard this, they declared war. Before the Russians could mobilize, the Ottomans attacked and won a resounding victory at the Battle of Karamsanis. Humiliated, the Russians poured all of their energy into mobilizing and soon began marching south. Within months, they reached the gates of Constantinople, but making further progress proved impossible. By the Treaty of 1878, Russia had claimed all of the Ottoman provinces in the Balkans, but failed to secure any territorial gains in Asia. Alexander III blamed the military failures on industrial weaknesses and set about modernizing the country. New weapons, new training regiments, a new plan for mobilization. The results were immediate. By 1900, Russia boasted the largest standing army in the world, over 1 million strong, and by 1914, it was the second largest navy as well. But, like his father, Alexander overlooked one crucial fact. A larger army does not necessarily mean a stronger arm. The test would come 6 years later when the Austrians declared war on Serbia following the assassination of their heir. In July, the Russians were caught flat-footed. Under normal circumstances, they would have had 12 days to mobilize. But the generals miscalculated the distances involved and cut the mobilization orders short. When they finally arrived, only a few dozen trains were available to move troops. Had the war begun that day, Russia would have lost. But miraculously, the Germans had made the same mistake. They, too, had given their troops too little time to prepare. So, when the Russians began their offensive on August, the Germans were forced to retreat. That buying Russia enough time to finish mobilization, they drove deep into Prussia, winning major battles at Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes. But, like all good news, this, too, was short-lived, with the remaining German forces pushed back to the coast. The Russians became cocky. They left their positions undefended, believing the Germans incapable of launching a counterattack. What followed is known as the blunder of the Tannenberg, when the Germans launched a surprise attack and destroyed 5 Russian armies. Unable to replenish their ranks, the Germans began moving west. With each passing week, they pushed the Russians back east. By the end of 1914, the Eastern Front stretched over 400 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And therein lay the problem. Russia's vast territory made fighting a nearly impossible task. Even if victorious, the armies would spend months simply repositioning themselves. It was a quagmire. While the front lines stabilized, the war dragged on. Food supplies dwindled. Soldiers froze in the winter cold, and people everywhere began to ask how much longer. By early 1917, public sentiment had shifted. Workers staged strikes demanding peace. Peasants seized estates and began distributing food among themselves. The army itself began falling apart. Men deserted their posts, threw down their weapons, and headed home. When the military couldn't stop deserters, they stopped punishing them. When the government couldn't feed the army, they allowed soldiers to forage for themselves. Soon, the front line became a joke throughout the country. After all, who would protect the homeland if not the army? The whole thing was collapsing from within. As if things couldn't get worse, the war turned against the Russians yet again. On March, the Germans launched a massive assault near the city of Pskov, outnumbered 3-1. The Russians held out for 8 days, but eventually retreated. As they pulled back, they abandoned hundreds of thousands of wounded and dead. It was the biggest disaster in Russian military history, and it broke the last vestiges of support for the war. This time, the public demanded the abdication of the Tsar. Nicholas II had resisted calls for peace and land reform, refusing to listen to the people he had sworn to protect. And now, the walls were closing in. The army was in shambles, the economy was in ruins, the people were starving, and the war was unwinnable. On February, a group of soldiers, sailors, and workers gathered in the capital of Petrograd to protest the war and demand peace. Within days, the crowds grew to tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The city's police force and military refused to crack down on the protesters, so the government called in the army. But when the soldiers arrived at the capital, they defected, joining the very protests they were supposed to put down. In February, the crowd stormed the Winter Palace and arrested the members of the provisional government. Early the next morning, they delivered an ultimatum to Nicholas II, demanding his abdication in exchange for the release of the government. When he refused, the crowd grew angry. They surrounded his palace, cut the telephone lines, and prepared to storm the building. Nicholas knew he had lost the army and the people. Later that day, he abdicated the throne. After 304 years of Romanov rule, Russia was without a monarch, but not without problems. Who should lead the country now? The provisional government wanted to continue the fight, but the Petrograd Soviet wanted peace. The workers and soldiers who had led the revolution wanted land and factories. The question was, who would prevail? At first, it looked like the moderates. The provisional government took control, reorganized the military, and attempted to carry out limited land reforms. Then the Germans invaded. Faced with this new threat, the workers and soldiers rallied behind the original demands: peace and land. That's when Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party seized their opportunity. While the rest of the government debated what to do, the Bolsheviks had already decided they would take over. In October, they launched an armed insurrection, taking over key government buildings and arresting the leadership of the provisional government. Now the real fight began. The next 2 years would be the most radical in Russian history. First came the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ceded all Russian territories to the Central Powers. Then came the Russian Revolution, which created the world's first communist state. The seeds of all this were sown in the reforms of 1861, when the shackles of serfdom were replaced by the shackles of state dependence. Alexander II thought he had bought himself some time, but instead bought himself a revolution. And so, after 300 years of trying, the Russian people were finally free. The year is 1914. Europe is tense. A powder keg of alliances and enmities. When the Austrians declare war on Serbia after their Franz Ferdinand has met his demise in Sarajevo, within weeks, the Russians have declared for Serbia and are readying their army. But there's a problem. The Russian army is not ready, and as it scrambles to get itself mobilized, it reveals a country on the brink. Its railroads can't move enough supplies. Its weapons and ammunition stockpiles are dangerously low, and there isn't enough food or even proper shoes for its soldiers. As one soldier put it, "We shall go to the war barefoot, clad in rags and without rifles." He wasn't kidding. Many Russian soldiers will fight World War I in nothing but rags. They might have been barefoot, too, if they had shoes. There's a saying in Russian that goes, "Measure your legs twice before you buy boots." Well, Russia should have measured twice when it came to World War I, because its lack of preparation would be the first of many disasters to befall the Russian army. By the late 19th century, Russia was a giant straddling two worlds, an empire desperate to modernize, yet chained to its feudal past. The Industrial Revolution swept through Europe, but in Russia, progress limped. Factories rose in Moscow and St. Petersburg, drawing masses of landless peasants into cities. But conditions were brutal. 12-hour days, starvation wages, and suffocating tenements became the norm. Workers, like peasants before them, discovered that freedom offered little dignity. This misery fueled a political awakening. Underground groups, from anarchists to socialists, whispered of radical change. Among them, a young Vladimir Lenin found inspiration in Marx, channeling anger into ideology. Meanwhile, the Tsars clung to divine authority, believing repression could silence discontent. Yet Russia's defeats in war, first in Crimea, later against Japan in 1905, exposed the empire's weakness. Strikes, riots, and mutinies erupted. The 1905 revolution shook the monarchy to its core, forcing Nicholas II to grant a parliament, the Duma. But the gesture was hollow. The Tsar never intended to share power. Disillusion deepened. The gulf between rulers and ruled widened beyond repair. What had begun as a peasant's grievance was now a nation's fury. Then came World War I. The war in the East was going badly. In August, a Japanese ultimatum arrived, demanding half of Sakhalin Island. When Nicholas rejected it, Japan struck, quickly overwhelming Russian forces. Despite pleas from Nicholas, the Duma refused to declare war. Instead, they passed laws granting themselves more power. The enraged Tsar dismissed the Duma and took personal control of the military, hoping for victory abroad to restore his authority at home. It did not help that millions of ethnic Germans lived within the borders of the Russian Empire. At the outbreak of war, many of these ethnic Germans switched their allegiance to Germany. German troops were soon sweeping across Poland and Belarus, threatening to take Moscow itself. The war went badly for Russia. More than 1 million men had been lost by 1915. By this point, soldiers were openly discussing mutiny and desertion. Officers knew that if the army collapsed, there would be a revolution. So they began doing the unthinkable. Some officers reached out to the socialists and communists in the cities and made deals with them. They agreed that the soldiers under their command would not turn against them if the socialists promised amnesty and an end to the draft. Other officers even agreed to join the socialists and communists, hoping to use their influence to transform the army into a revolutionary force. In 1916, Nicholas gave command of the army to his brother-in-law, Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich. He hoped that Paul's prestige and popularity would lift the army's flagging morale. But it did not work. Soldiers continued to desert and die, and entire units switched sides. With the front collapsing, Paul fled with his family to Crimea. While thousands of old aristocrats joined anti-Tsarist groups, hundreds of thousands of soldiers deserted. When they fled, they didn't just abandon the war effort. They abandoned everything the Romanov dynasty stood for. This was not a war of choice for most Russians. Soldiers were conscripted into service, and once they got there, they saw no glory and little hope. At the front, men slept in filthy trenches, half frozen and hungry. Food supplies were almost non-existent. There was no medical care, so when they got sick or injured, they just died. They saw no purpose in fighting for an incompetent Tsar, so they deserted by the hundreds of thousands. In some cases, entire divisions laid down their arms and walked away from the front. Some surrendered to the Germans, others joined the anti-Tsarist forces. Many of these deserters were commoners who had never known any freedom. Now they were living it up with the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks fed them, gave them a place to sleep, and promised them a better future. As all this was happening, the rest of Russia was descending into chaos. With the army collapsing, the question of who would succeed Nicholas was becoming increasingly pressing. On March 1917, women in Petrograd staged a demonstration in support of bread. Riots broke out. The next day, workers joined the women and demanded an end to the war and the abdication of the Tsar. Nicholas hesitated. His ministers urged him to abdicate in favor of his son, but he refused. Alexandra was horrified. She never imagined that her family would be ousted from power, let alone by a bunch of angry women. She begged her husband to do what was necessary to save the dynasty, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Finally, his ministers convinced him to abdicate in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich. But Michael wasn't interested in taking the throne. He abdicated immediately, and Russia had no Tsar. With the army collapsing, the economy in ruins, and the people starving, it was clear that Russia needed new leadership. The provisional government assumed power and promised free elections. For the first time, Russia's commoners could imagine that they might live in a democracy. The leader of the socialist revolutionaries, Alexander Kerensky, was appointed prime minister. Under his leadership, the provisional government made some significant reforms. It introduced universal suffrage, legalized labor unions, and allowed soldiers to form their own Soviets, which were elected by soldiers and run by committees of soldiers. These Soviets quickly became centers of political activity. They issued orders to commanders and controlled the supply of weapons and ammunition. But while the provisional government was committed to democracy, it was less enthusiastic about giving power to the Soviets. When the Soviets demanded seats on the provisional government, Kerensky refused. The Soviets responded by forming their own government, the All-Russian Soviet, or the Soviets for short. And so Russia found itself with not one, but two governments. While the Soviets were popular among the soldiers, sailors, and urban workers, the provisional government enjoyed the support of the wealthy landowners and industrialists. The two governments struggled for power until October, when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized key government buildings and arrested the leaders of the provisional government. The Bolsheviks then established a new government, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or the USSR. The Bolsheviks were committed to a truly egalitarian society, and they set about dismantling the old order. They abolished the monarchy, dissolved the old parliament, and replaced it with a new one dominated by Bolsheviks, and reorganized the army along Soviet lines. The Bolshevik takeover was not universally popular, and a civil war soon broke out between the Reds and the Whites. The Whites were made up of a variety of anti-Bolshevik forces, including monarchists, liberals, socialists, and nationalists. The Reds were victorious, and by 1922, all of Russia was under Bolshevik control. Russia emerged from World War I exhausted and diminished. Its population had been decimated by war and famine, and its economy was in ruins. But it was also a changed country. The war had brought about the collapse of the old regime and the rise of a new one. The Bolsheviks had promised their followers a better future, and now it was up to them to deliver. If you want to know how the Reds and Whites clashed in the Russian Civil War, then click right here to watch our next video. And don't forget to subscribe for more content. The story of Russia's fall from grace begins in 1861, not with a bang, but with an edict. As the sun rose over the vast plains of the Russian Empire, news spread like wildfire through the sleepy villages. A new day is dawning. The shackles of serfdom are gone. You are free. Over 23 million serfs, peasants legally bound to their landlords, were declared free. It seemed like a victory for humanity, a step out of the shadows of medieval oppression. But this apparent triumph was built on a foundation of sand. For while Alexander II, the then Russian monarch, abolished serfdom, he did so by chaining his subjects to new masters. Freedom now meant unfreedom, and as the centuries passed, these chains tightened around the necks of millions, choking their hopes and dreams, turning neighbor against neighbor, and sowing the seeds of discontent that would eventually tear down the pillars of the Russian Empire. To truly understand how we got here, we must go back to the beginning of the beginning. In the year 1600, Russia was a powder keg ready to explode. A century of misrule under the Rurik dynasty had left the nation exhausted, depleted, and ripe for change. Enter the Romanov family. Mikhail Romanov, a young boy of only 13, ascended to the throne in 1613, marking the beginning of a new era in Russian history. With him at the helm, Russia took tentative steps toward stability and prosperity. By 1682, the Romanov dynasty had grown in power and influence, but also in ruthlessness. Peter I, a man of insatiable ambition, inherited the crown. Under his iron fist, Russia transformed into a formidable force. He modernized the army, reformed the state apparatus, and dragged the nation kicking and screaming into the modern world. But amidst all the grandeur and glory, Peter overlooked a ticking time bomb. He failed to address the plight of the serfs, the backbone of Russia's population. Fast forward to 1725, and we find Peter's wife, Catherine the Great, at the helm. She ascended to the throne after a swift and decisive coup that ousted her husband, Peter II. Catherine, a woman of intelligence and ambition, inherited a massive empire. However, she soon realized that the wheels of the Russian state were rusty and creaking under the weight of its own complexity. One of her most significant challenges was the burgeoning bureaucracy. As the empire expanded, so did the number of officials required to keep it running. But the quality of these bureaucrats often left much to be desired. They were notoriously corrupt, inefficient, and unaccountable, a situation that Catherine aimed to rectify. Her vision was a streamlined state apparatus that ran like clockwork, a machine that would serve as the backbone of her expanding empire. However, Catherine's ambitions didn't stop at the borders of her empire. She yearned for more, for her place in history as a champion of Enlightenment values. This desire led her to initiate a series of legal reforms aimed at modernizing Russia along the lines of Enlightenment ideals. But in practice, these reforms often fell short of their lofty goals. The reality of 18th-century Russia was far from the idealized world of John Locke or Montesquieu. The lives of ordinary Russians remained largely unchanged, and for many, they became increasingly worse. Catherine's dream of a harmonious, enlightened society remained just that, a dream. The seeds of discontent began to sprout, taking root in the harsh realities of life under the thumb of an absolute monarchy. In 1796, Paul came to power. His reign was marked by erratic behavior, including secret police, censorship, and a reversal of some of Catherine's reforms. But it was during his brief tenure that the rift between the nobility and the serfs widened, setting the stage for future unrest. Then came Alexander I, a man caught between the ideals of the French Revolution and the demands of his autocratic rule. His journey began with a promise of reform, harkening back to the ideals of the French Revolution. Alexander envisioned a Russia transformed, a nation that would shed the shackles of autocracy and embrace the ideals of liberty and equality. His early reforms, including the abolition of torture and the introduction of a constitution, seemed to validate this vision. But as Alexander's reign progressed, his reforms lost steam. The contradictions of his rule became increasingly apparent. While he paid lip service to the ideals of the French Revolution, he was unwilling to relinquish the autocratic powers that had been the cornerstone of the Romanov dynasty for decades. This inconsistency created a volatile mix, a powder keg of expectations and dashed hopes. As the 19th century dawned, the pressure cooker of Russian society began to whistle, and at the center of this maelstrom sat Alexander II, a man who would become a pivotal figure in this tale. Alexander, unlike his predecessors, understood the urgency of change. He saw the writing on the wall, the rumblings in the streets, the whispers of discontent that had become a roar. In 1825, he ascended to the throne, with the weight of an empire on his shoulders and a vision of reform in his heart. Early signs were promising. He initiated changes that reverberated across the vast expanse of his empire, shaking the foundations of autocracy and setting hearts racing with hope. Among the most significant of these reforms was the emancipation of the serfs. For over 2 centuries, the serfs had borne the brunt of Russia's socio-economic structure, their lives a tapestry of hardship and despair. Alexander's promise to end this archaic system sent ripples of anticipation across the land. But as with any seismic shift, the tremors were felt not only by those who benefited, but also by those who stood to lose. The impending change threatened to unravel the very fabric of Russian society. At the core of this upheaval stood the nobility, their privileged world teetering on the brink of transformation. For generations, they had held the reins of power, their status secured by the very system that Alexander sought to dismantle. Now, as the chains of serfdom were poised to be broken, the nobility scented danger. Their way of life, their very identity, was at stake. Alexander walked a tightrope, attempting to balance the hopes of millions with the entrenched interests of the nobility. His objective was clear: to usher in a new era of freedom while preserving the stability of his empire. But, as history has shown, such tightrope walks are precarious at best. Then came March 1881, the day that would forever alter the course of Russian history. Alexander, driven by his commitment to reform, signed the Emancipation Manifesto. setting in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of the Russian Empire. With a stroke of his pen, over 23 million serfs were declared free. It seemed like a triumph, a victory for human dignity over centuries of oppression. But beneath the surface, freedom was laced with bitter pills. The serfs, now free from the shackles of their landlords, received little land of their own, just tiny strips of soil that mocked their newfound freedom. To make matters worse, they were saddled with redemption payments to the state, a financial burden that crippled generations. Instead of prosperity, millions found themselves mired in debt and destitution. The irony was as stark as it was cruel. They were free, but in their freedom, they were poorer than before. As the dust settled, the true cost of Alexander's reforms became apparent. The nobility, once the pillars of Russian society, found their privileges eroded, their wealth diminished. The serfs, though technically liberated, were trapped in a cycle of poverty and despair. The middle class, the potential engine of social mobility, remained stunted and marginalized. The Russian Empire, instead of ascending to new heights, found itself fractured, divided by resentment and simmering discontent. It was a far cry from the vision of a harmonious, prosperous Russia that Alexander had once harbored. But the story doesn't end here. The seeds of discontent sown by the emancipation of the serfs took root and grew. Nurtured by the harsh realities of life in late imperial Russia, the stage was set for a revolution that would shake the world. Join me next time as we delve into the depths of revolutionary fervor, exploring how the ideas of Marx and Lenin took hold in Russia. Together, we'll witness the rise of a new generation of thinkers and activists who dared to dream of a world transformed. From the hallowed halls of intellectual salons to the bustling streets of industrial centers, we'll uncover the forces that propelled Russia towards the brink of upheaval. Don't miss this pivotal chapter in our journey through the fall of the Russian Empire. Stay tuned, because in part 2, we will examine how Marxism found fertile ground in Russia's urban centers and intellectual circles. We'll explore the allure of Marxist ideas for a population grappling with the harsh realities of industrialization and rapid social change. The story of the Russian Revolution is one of hope and despair, of dreams deferred and shattered. It's a tale that continues to resonate in our world today. Your support helps keep this journey possible. So, if you find our work valuable, please consider supporting us. Together, we can continue to bring these stories to life, ensuring that the echoes of the past continue to inform and inspire us in the present and for generations to come.